That was a serious humiliation for your office, wasn't it?
Our position would be whoever commits a crime, and it doesn't matter what country they're from or how rich they are or how poor they are or how powerful, or they should face justice.
In many parts of the world, human rights groups are facing an increasingly vicious backlash from governments and non-state actors that seek to cover up their violations. In Afghanistan, where the Taliban is imposing tight restrictions on freedom, they endure especially harsh conditions. My guest this week is Rupert Colville, spokesman for the UN's Human Rights Chief. He joins me from Geneva. How does he explain the growing gap between the commitments of the member states to justice and good governance and the often brutal reality on the ground? Rupert Colville, welcome to Conflict Zone. Let me take you back to August the 16th this year, when the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, your boss, Michelle Bachelet, issued a desperate call to the international community to intervene and stop the human rights abuses in Afghanistan. It's unacceptable, she said, for states to stand on the sidelines when the Taliban overruns the territory of Afghanistan and engages in acts that may amount to war crimes. Which states was that appeal aimed at?
Well, there were a lot of states involved in Afghanistan. Obviously, there were all the states that had military forces in the country that progressively withdrew them. There are the neighboring states which have influence over one or other parties in the country. So I think there are a lot of states, and then there are states further afield, such as China and Russia and so on. So I think there are plenty of states who can influence the situation one way or another, and really it was a general call to all of them.
But they chose not to. They chose not to. Nobody answered that call. It came from the most senior human rights official in the United Nations, and yet not a single state lifted a finger. That was a serious humiliation for your office, wasn't it?
Well, I think, states actually did step up to try and do the evacuations, and something like 300,000 to 400,000 Afghans got out of the country in the weeks following the capture on 15th of August by the Taliban. They did at least step up to help evacuate people, but of course that's far from over. There are many people who are still extremely fearful and in many cases, genuinely possibly at risk. So the evacuations and the acceptance of people into other countries needs to continue.
But this was an urgent appeal. Your boss said the people of Afghanistan deserve better than to endure the silence and bystanding of the member states of the United Nations at this perilous moment. Silence and bystanding in the face of massive human rights violation. It's not often the UN chooses to slap its members around the face like that, is it? That's quite an accusation.
Well, yeah. It's not the first time we've criticized states. For example, Syria, all the years of failing to deal with the developing conflict in Syria, or preferably preventing its breaking out in the first place. So no, it's not actually that rare that we call quite strongly on states to do things, and of course on individual states to stop human rights violations that they're committing.
But to get no response at all shows a wider lesson, doesn't it? That where states are made aware that the lives and rights of many millions of people hang in the balance, even those that trumpet human rights as their core values will actually do nothing to protect the innocent when the chips are down. That's an appalling setback with huge ramifications, isn't it? If your states won't lift a finger to help people under those circumstances.
Yeah. No, that's right, but I think you have to remember the context of her call, which was in a special session in the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. That's the 47-body state body here in Geneva. So the context she was speaking in those terms was calling on the Human Rights Council to bring in preferably some sort of major inquiry. In the end, they created a special rapporteur, which is an individual UN expert to keep tabs on the situation in Afghanistan. But so it was a slightly different context. It wasn't calling for military intervention or anything like that, because it was obviously way beyond that point. But I think we need now to really look at the future, because the reality is what it is in Afghanistan. And there are huge problems now, and we have to live with the situation as it is and try and alleviate the looming catastrophe that faces the Afghan population.
I want to come on to that catastrophe in a little while, but you said that the Human Rights Council agreed to a special rapporteur. That was actually the minimum they could do. Pakistan rejected the High Commissioner's calls for a fact-finding mission to the country back in August, along with the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation members. What does it tell you that they didn't even want to find out what the violations were that were taking place and have them recorded as evidence for potential trials? What does that tell you about their attitude to seeking justice or accountability?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly didn't get, I think, the best of what we hoped would come out of that. But that said, it doesn't mean it's not all or nothing. It's not, you don't get what you call for and that's the end of human rights monitoring in Afghanistan. Far from it. So, we're monitoring now as best we can. It's very difficult at the moment, but the monitoring will continue and the human rights violations will become apparent with all the difficulties there are in Afghanistan in terms of verification, in terms of travel. It's a huge and very difficult country to navigate at the best of times, let alone in the kind of very uncertain circumstances we have right now. But, hopefully that will improve as time goes along and we'll start to have a better grip on exactly what's happening all across the country.
You talk about getting a better grip on information. Earlier in August, you'd flagged up reports coming to you of summary executions, attacks against current and former government officials and their families, forced expulsions of people from their homes. Were those reports later borne out by subsequent information that you received?
Yes, certainly those things have been happening. What's, I think, much more of a question mark is what kind of scale. It doesn't seem to be happening on a big scale. In fact, some of the kind of worst fears of what might happen after Taliban took over Kabul and the other big cities doesn't seem to have been borne out to this point. That said, clearly there have been some individual very ugly violations. Now, whether those are, Taliban decisions or whether it's just some Taliban who are doing these things or it's simply local rivalries and revenge and so on, that's a bit harder to verify. We're still struggling a bit to verify those kind of incidents. It's not so easy to travel and to check up on information. There's a lot of turmoil, I would say, in the human rights community in Afghanistan, a lot of fear. So a lot of the kind of information networks and so on aren't fully functioning. But there's a lot of effort going to get that back on track. The humanitarians they're back on track to a much greater degree. But the human rights world is still suffering, I would say, from initial kind of shock. And of course, quite a few people have left the country.
Very few of the players in Afghanistan would emerge from a detailed investigation of their activities over the last 20 years with their human rights credentials intact, would they? And perhaps that's why they're not pushing now for accountability.
Well, that's right. But I mean, I think one very important measure for the Taliban, the Taliban very much want acceptance. They want to be recognized as the government. They're not recognized as the government right now. And one aspect of that will be that they actually have accountability for excesses by their own people. So if Taliban are committing violations, they need to take care of that, and that will be the message they get repeatedly. Now, whether they will, whether they won't, is another matter. But, one can't lose hope that there will never be accountability for anything ever in Afghanistan. We've seen other countries in the world. It's taken a long time, but you have actually had sometimes quite considerable accountability at the end of the day. You'll never get everybody into court who should be in court. You'll never get everyone jailed who should be jailed for horrendous abuses. But hopefully at some point, we're still seeing Nazis from World War II appearing in courts aged 100. So at some point, hopefully there will be some accountability in Afghanistan, but it's not on the immediate horizon, that's for sure.
But those countries that you might expect to help you bring about that accountability, like the US, for instance, they're not going to give you any help in investigating their troops because they never do, are they? They're not going to be looking at the highly controversial interrogation centre that they once ran at Bagram Airport. It just isn't going to happen, is it? It goes into the drawer marked too difficult and gets left.
You may well be right, but hopefully you'll be wrong. But we'll see. I mean, look, there are situations elsewhere in the world. I would say Argentina, for example, Chile, where you had horrendous human rights abuses during the times of the dictatorships. Nobody had any hope that people responsible would ever end up in court, and that's actually been reversed. So you've had, I think, well over 1,000 cases in Argentina. You've had hundreds of cases in Chile dealing with those crimes that were committed like 30, 35 years ago. So it can happen. The wheels of justice can be incredibly slow, but it can happen, it should happen, and people will go on calling for it to happen because, of course, Afghans themselves who've suffered from the violations from the various warlords in the 1990s, from the Taliban as well, and indeed from foreign forces, will still be pushing for it, and there is evidence and so on and so forth. So we'll see. I mean, I think we should park that for the immediate moment because there are far more immediate concerns right now, which is like keeping half the population alive. But justice certainly shouldn't be forgotten, and you're absolutely right about that.
You can park it for a while, but it's not a good start when the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court says he's asked for permission to resume war crimes investigations in the country, but will not be examining the actions of US forces due to lack of resources. Isn't that a huge dent in the legitimacy of the whole process? The Afghan human rights activist Horia Mossadegh called the announcement an insult to thousands of other victims of crimes by Afghan government forces and US and NATO forces. She's right, isn't she?
Well, yeah, I mean, our position would be whoever commits a crime, and it doesn't matter what country they're from or how rich they are or how poor they are or how powerful, or they should face justice. And that's, at the national scale and also at the international scale. It's not for me to intervene in International Criminal Court. They're quite capable of making their own calls and making their own decisions. And they are at least engaged in Afghanistan, which was a significant step forward because that took several years to come about. But they are engaged. On what terms and how far they're managed to get and what resources they're given, that's another matter. But I can't really speak for them. I think that's a fight they have to fight.
Well, it isn't going to do your cause any good if the methods of the International Criminal Court are not seen as fair and equally targeting all those players who were involved in Afghanistan and almost certainly were involved in human rights abuses in Afghanistan. The whole process has to be seen to have legitimacy, doesn't it? Otherwise, it doesn't do you any good either, does it?
No, that's absolutely right. But again, that takes time. Actually, I listened to a very interesting interview the other day with Philippe Sands, who's a very well-known international barrister who wrote an extraordinary book about Nuremberg trials and everything that led up to them in World War II. And he points out, yes, it's slow, but it happened. The fact that the ICC was even created was something that wasn't on the radar 10 years earlier. So it takes time. You don't have instant perfection with something like the ICC. It's going to take years and decades to really, the initial complaint against the ICC was it was only dealing with cases in Africa. Well, now it's dealing with a case in Afghanistan. Maybe it's not proceeding perfectly, but it's proceeding. So already that's an advance over the situation 5 years ago. So it's slow. I mean, that's how it is, but you don't get these massive international kind of systems up and running smoothly and perfectly overnight, even over a decade or 2 decades. It takes a long, long time. Now, we all wish it would be quicker, and we wish, everybody who should face justice would face justice. That's not reality, but, they're chipping away, and Philippe Sands was really quite interesting. He was much more optimistic about the development than, of course, if one comes at it, you can find any number of things that are going wrong and are not following the true path they should do. But slowly, you're seeing the International Court spreading its jurisdiction into more continents, into more countries, and hopefully over time they will continue to get stronger.
Well, you say that, but it's hard looking around the world not to see impunity as a growth industry. If you look, for instance, at Mali in West Africa, in June, the High Commissioner implored the authorities there to break what she called the cycle of impunity in the wake of serious violations. She called for prompt, thorough, impartial and effective investigation into all allegations of abuses, including those committed by the military. And nothing happened. You might as well be talking to the wind. The fact is that governments like Mali and others around the world are no longer embarrassed about human rights violations, are they? They have an expectation they're going to get away with them.
Yeah, I would say there's been a deterioration in respect for human rights, but there never was total respect for human rights, never has been and probably never will be. So again, it's a question of scale and quantity. You are having cases that come into courts on human rights issues in many countries. Mali, you're talking about Mali today. Mali in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, it may be a different situation. So, you've got a military government at the moment. There's been 2 coups in the recent years. It's a complex situation. And yes, absolutely, we're pointing the finger that they absolutely do need to discipline their own forces, because at the end of the day, if you have impunity, if you're a government or you're a regime or you're a non-government but you're in effective control, if you don't control your own thugs and your own abusers, it backfires on you because it alienates the population from you, and that's going to cause you major problems down the line. So in the end, it's actually in the interests of authorities everywhere to have a system of justice that's working, to be seen to be fair, to be seen to be decisive, and to be seen to discipline their own people. Now, many of them don't. Some of them do a bit, some of them don't do it all, some of them improve, some of them get worse. And that's unfortunately the situation we have in the world. It's very far from perfect, but it's also not a lost cause. So I think one can be too melodramatic, really, about what is essentially, everywhere, it's a temporary situation. It could get worse, but it could get better. It should get better. There will be pressure for it to get better.
But you talked about this deterioration.
At the end of the day, if you don't have human rights...
You talked about this deterioration in respect for human rights. What are the tools, what other tools can you bring to the table to try and reverse this process? Because it's not going in the right direction, is it? It's some extent it's not going in the right direction, but there are many little, of course one tends to hear the bad news, one doesn't really hear the good news. So, there are actually many advances in human rights here and there. They're incremental, they may seem small, but collectively it's quite significant. If you look at the progress on human rights over the past 30, 40, 50 years, they're huge. You look at the progress on women's rights, it's huge. Progress on LGBT rights around the world. It's huge. It's not huge everywhere. It's going backwards in some places. But Rupert Colville, look at Yemen for instance. Let's look at Yemen for instance. This is perhaps the worst news on impunity. Bahrain, Russia, other members of the Human Rights Council have forced it to shut down its war crimes investigations. Now that's a huge defeat for Western states who'd sought to keep those investigations going for another 2 years. That must be and is extraordinarily demoralizing for you and for people who are working in the human rights arena in this bloodbath that Yemen has become over the years.
Yes, I mean, we do see that as very regrettable. But again, it doesn't mean it's not so absolute, I mean, yes, that type of inquiry was not continued and it was expected to be continued. But that doesn't mean human rights shuts off and everyone shuts down and closes down and packs up and goes home and that's the end of it.
No, but these all set precedents. These individual cases all set...
There are many people doing that.
They all set precedents, don't they? You have a conflict in Yemen which has been especially brutal and has involved a variety of states in war crimes of the worst kind. Extrajudicial killing, targeting of civilians, torture, denial of medical supplies, things like that. And some of your key members on the Human Rights Council have effectively shut down the investigation. That is a huge retrograde step, isn't it? Let's not beat about the bush. That's bad news, and it would be bad news for other cases in the future.
It's a retrograde step. Well, not necessarily. Again, the Human Rights Council is a political body. It's 47 states out of the 190 plus states in the world. It rotates. Every year there are members who go down from it and new members come in. It changes character. There are certain issues where you get unanimity, where there's agreement across the board. There are certain others that are highly contentious. There's political stuff going on behind the scenes. Unfortunately, the states don't look at it with a pure human rights lens. They look at it from a political lens in many cases. So yes, you get some steps in the Human Rights Council that are very regrettable. On the other hand, you get some steps that are a step forward. We had a recent, first time ever, the recognition of the right to a sustainable environment. So that keys into the current climate change issue, which is, the biggest existential issue the world faces right now. So it's not all negative, and it's not all permanent. So, and what you do have is a very solid foundation of international human rights law that continues to exist. Whether it's observed or not observed, it's there, it's the benchmark. It's something for populations, individuals, NGOs, media, us, many people to hang on to, and it's there, and it's immutable, and it's can be invoked. Now,
it can be invoked. It can also be ignored, and is being. It can also be ignored, can't it?
It can, yeah.
And the gap between what is written in those firm and solemn commitments and what's happening on the ground is ever wider in many areas, isn't it?
It's wider in some areas, it's maybe narrowing in other areas. I mean, again, you tend to hear the failures, you don't necessarily hear the successes, or the successes very quickly get taken for granted. There are things that are being taken totally for granted today in many countries, which 20 years ago were highly contentious, and nobody thought they'd improve ever. So it's a constant, imperfect effort to build and strengthen and protect people everywhere, with many setbacks, but also advances. And if you lose hope, if you say, okay, it's useless, we're never going to get anywhere, well, then that's what you will get. That's the end result you'll get. But unfortunately, there are many, many people who haven't gone that far down the line of despair.
We talked earlier.
Will come out and will continue to fight for their rights. So,
Rupert Colville, we talked earlier about Taliban seeking recognition with all their atrocities, their killing and their rights violations ongoing. They want a place in the General Assembly. Is the UN going to give it to them? Should it? It's only last March that a unanimous Security Council resolution noted that the Taliban is not recognized at the UN. Furthermore, the Security Council does not support the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Now that they've bombed and fought their way and terrorized their way into power, should they be given recognition by the international community for that?
That's ultimately a political question, and that's ultimately one states will decide themselves. Right now they've said no, or they haven't said yes, let's put it that way. And we'll have to see how that develops. I think the reality on the ground is the Taliban are in effective control of virtually all the country. We as the UN, the humanitarian agencies, human rights, so on, we have to deal with that situation. So on the one level, you've got the political processes by states, whether it's in the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, or bilaterally or in groups or so on. And that's normal business that they will do, and they have to make their own decisions whether they will not or will recognize the Taliban.
Very briefly, you have more than
getting into that.
You have more than a dozen ministers in the Taliban cabinet or on a UN blacklist, including the group's foreign minister. To recognize all of them would simply make a mockery of the UN, wouldn't it?
Well, good question to ask the states who have to make those decisions. Again, that's not something we would get involved with. That's a political decision. But I would say, if there are people there's evidence of crimes, then we could definitely say those people should be investigated if there's sufficient evidence and prosecuted for those serious crimes. I think, when you're talking about the Taliban cabinet, interim administration is what it's referred to, I think the other key issue is there are no women on it. And that is, I think, given the Taliban came in and they had gave assurances that women would be allowed to work, women would be allowed to go to school, etc. That was a very sharp setback in terms of them keeping to their promises. A lot of advances have been made on the women's issue over the past 20 years. There were still huge steps to take to make things, really equitable. But there had been huge progress, including women ministers, women vice ministers, women judges, women senior women civil servants, women ambassadors, and so on. So at the stroke of a pen, you now have a ruling interim administration with not a single woman in that administration. So that's something that's obviously being raised with the Taliban, along with all the other issues relating to women and girls. And again, you won't expect great progress overnight or even in weeks or months, but it's a fight that has to be kept up.
Rupert Colville, it's been good to have you on the program. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for being on Conflict Zone.
Thanks, Tim.